The winter of 1347 came to Ravenbrook like a curse wrapped in ice. The village, nestled in a valley between ancient forests and barren hills, had always been poor. But this winter was different. The frost arrived early, killing the last of the harvest before it could be gathered. The river froze solid, trapping fish beneath sheets of ice so thick that axes bounced off them. Smoke rose thin and desperate from chimneys as families burned their furniture just to survive another night. Margaret Hale knelt in the snow outside the abandoned chapel, her knees sinking into the frozen ground. Her breath came in ragged clouds, and her hands, raw and cracked from work, were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Behind her, in their small stone cottage, her 5 children waited. Thomas, the eldest at 12, tried to keep the younger ones quiet. There was Alina, 10 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and stubborn chin. Then came the twins, William and Anne, barely 8, who clung to each other for warmth. And finally, little Edmund, only 5, who had stopped asking for food 2 days ago. Margaret's husband, Robert, had died 3 winters past, killed in a skirmish on the Scottish border. Since then, she had worked the fields, mended clothes for pennies, and sold what little they had. But now there was nothing left. No food, no coin, no hope. The chapel before her had been abandoned for years. The local priest claimed it was cursed, that something dark had taken root there. The wooden door hung crooked on its hinges, and the stone cross above the entrance was cracked down the middle, as if struck by lightning. But Margaret had nowhere else to turn. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "if there is any power that still listens, if there is any mercy left in this world, save my children. Take me if you must, but let them live." The wind howled through the valley, carrying her words away into the darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the air changed. It grew colder, impossibly colder, and the wind stopped as if held back by an invisible hand. The snow around Margaret began to glow with a faint silvery light. She looked up, her heart pounding, and saw that the clouds above had parted, revealing a pale moon. And in that moonlight, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. He was tall, taller than any man Margaret had ever seen. He wore a cloak of deep crimson that seemed to drink in the light, and beneath it, armor of black steel, etched with symbols she did not recognize. His face was sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His hair was white as fresh snow, cut short and neat, and a trim white mustache framed his mouth. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. They glowed red like embers in the dark. "You called," the figure said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying across the snow without effort. "And I have answered." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She tried to stand, but her legs would not obey. Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, and as he did, the snow beneath his boots did not crunch. He moved with a grace that was not entirely human, his cloak flowing behind him like liquid shadow. "I am King Geard of Tritania," he said. "Some call me the Vampire King. Others call me the Shadow of the North, but tonight I am the answer to your prayer." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. King Geard was a legend, a monster from the old tales. They said he had ruled for centuries, that he drank the blood of the living, that his castle was a place of death and darkness. Mothers warned their children to behave, or Geard would come for them in the night. And now he stood before her. I didn't mean," she stammered. "You prayed for salvation," Geard interrupted, his red eyes fixed on hers. "And I offer it, but there is a price." Margaret forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling. "What price?" Geard's gaze drifted past her toward the cottage where her children waited. "You and your children will come with me to Tritania Keep. You will live under my roof, eat at my table, and be under my protection. In return, you will serve me not as slaves, but as members of my household. And if I refuse," Guard's expression did not change, "then the winter will take them one by one as it has taken so many others. The choice is yours, Margaret Hale." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. How did he know her name? But there was no time to wonder. Behind her, she heard Edmund cough, a wet, rattling sound that made her heart ache. She looked back at the cottage, then at Geard. "Will you harm them? No, will you drink their blood?" For the first time, something flickered in Geard's eyes, something that might have been pain. "I do not prey upon children, nor upon the innocent." Margaret searched his face, looking for deception, but all she saw was weariness, the kind that came from centuries of loneliness. She took a deep breath. "Then I accept." Geard nodded slowly. "Go, gather your children. We leave immediately." Margaret hurried back to the cottage, mind racing. She pushed open the door and found Thomas standing guard, a fire poker in his hands. Eleanor held Edmund in her lap, trying to keep him warm while the twins huddled together near the dying fire. "Mother," Thomas said, relief flooding his face. "We heard voices. Pack what you can carry," Margaret said quickly. "We're leaving now." "Leaving, but where?" "Trust me, Thomas, please." Her tone left no room for argument. The children moved quickly, gathering their few belongings into bundles. Margaret took one last look around the cottage, the place where she had laughed with Robert, where her children had been born, and felt a pang of grief. But grief was a luxury she could not afford. When they stepped outside, Gaillard was waiting. Behind him, 6 horses stood in perfect stillness, their eyes glowing faintly red in the darkness. They were magnificent creatures, cold black with manes that seemed to shimmer like smoke, Thomas gasped. "Mother, those horses I know," Margaret whispered. "Stay close to me." Gaillard gestured toward the horses. "Each of you will ride, I will lead." Margaret lifted Edmund onto one of the horses, then helped the twins and Eleanor mount. Thomas, despite his fear, climbed onto his horse with the determination of someone trying to be brave. Margaret took the last horse, her hands shaking as she gripped the reins. Gaillard mounted his own horse with effortless grace, then turned to look back at the village. "Say your farewells if you must. You will not return." Margaret looked back at Ravenbrook, at the dark cottages, the frozen fields, the life she had known. Then she looked at her children alive and safe and made her choice. "I'm ready," she said. Gaillard nodded. "Then follow me." He spurred his horse forward and the others followed. As they rode into the forest, a thick mist rose around them, glowing faintly gold in the moonlight. The villagers who woke the next morning would find the Hale cottage empty, with only footprints in the snow leading into the woods, and they would whisper in hushed tones that the vampire king had taken them, but none would dare to follow. The forest swallowed them whole. The mist that had risen around them grew thicker with every step, curling around the horses' legs like living tendrils. Margaret held Edmund close in front of her on the saddle, feeling his small body shiver despite the strange warmth that seemed to emanate from the horse itself. The creature moved with an unnatural smoothness, its hooves making no sound on the frozen ground. Ahead, Kingard rode in silence, his white hair catching the moonlight that somehow penetrated the dense canopy above. His crimson cloak billowed behind him, and Margaret noticed that the fabric never seemed to snag on branches, as if the forest itself bent away from him. "Mother," Thomas whispered from his horse beside her, his voice tight with fear. "Those horses, their eyes." "I know," Margaret said softly, "but they haven't harmed us. Stay calm." Eleanor, riding behind them with Anne clinging to her waist, spoke up with the bluntness of a 10-year-old. "Is he really a vampire like in Father Benedict's stories?" Before Margaret could answer, Gaillard's voice cut through the mist. "Father Benedict knew nothing of what I am." The children fell silent, startled that he had heard Eleanor's whisper from so far ahead. Gear did not turn around, but continued speaking, his voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "Your priest spoke of demons and devils, of creatures that exist only to spread evil. But the truth is far older and far more complicated than his simple tales." "Then what are you?" Thomas asked, finding courage in his curiosity. Ga was quiet for a moment, and Margaret thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I am what remains when death refuses to take you. I am a king who loved too deeply and lost everything. I am the guardian of Tritania, bound to its stones by blood and oath." He paused, "And I am very, very old." "How old?" William asked, his voice small. "I watched the Roman legions march north. I saw the first Saxon kings crowned. I have lived through plagues, wars, and the rise and fall of dynasties." Gaillard's voice held a note of weariness. "I have forgotten more years than you will ever live." The weight of those words settled over them like snow. Margaret found herself studying the figure ahead with new eyes. What must it be like? She wondered to carry so many lifetimes to watch the world change while you remained frozen in time. As if sensing her thoughts, Gaillard spoke again. "You wonder why I answered your prayer. It wasn't a question." Margaret swallowed. "Yes, because I heard desperation in your voice. True desperation. The kind that comes from a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her children." His shoulders tensed slightly. "I know that desperation." "You had children?" Elelina asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her fear. The silence that followed was profound. Even the horses seemed to slow their pace. "Once, Geard finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. A son, his name was Aldrich. He was 7 years old when the plague took him. My wife Isolde died 3 days later trying to save him with every urban prayer she knew. He stopped his horse and the others halted behind him. Geard remained facing forward, not looking at them. I was a mortal king then. I ruled justly, protected my people, and loved my family. But when they died, something in me broke. I sought out forbidden knowledge, ancient magic from the old times before Christianity came to these shores. I found a ritual, a way to cheat death itself. I thought, his voice cracked slightly. I thought if I became strong enough, immortal enough, I could protect everyone I loved from ever dying again. But you were too late, Margaret said softly. Yes, by the time I completed the transformation, they were already cold in their graves, and I discovered the curse that comes with this power. I would live forever, but I could never again walk in sunlight. I could never again feel the warmth of day, never taste mortal food, never grow old alongside those I might come to care for. Thomas frowned. But you said you don't drink the blood of innocents. What do I hunt those who deserve to be hunted? Gaillard said simply. Murderers, bandits, men who prey upon the weak. England has no shortage of such creatures. Their blood sustains me, and the world is better for their absence. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This was the monster of legend, but also something more complex. A man who had chosen damnation out of love and who now tried to make some kind of meaning from his curse. Why did you bring us to your castle? Anne asked suddenly, her small voice breaking the heavy atmosphere. Are we to be your servants? Gaillard finally turned his horse, looking back at them. In the moonlight, his face looked less frightening and more sad. Infinitely sad. My castle has been silent for 300 years, he said. The halls that once rang with laughter now echo only with emptiness. I brought you because... He hesitated as if unsure himself. Because I heard children's voices in your cottage, and I remembered what it was like to have a home filled with life. You're lonely, Edmund said simply with the innocent clarity only a 5-year-old could manage. Gaillard's red eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the child's directness. Then slowly he nodded. Yes, I am lonely. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not quite sympathy, not quite understanding, but something close to both. This creature before her, this legendary monster, was just a man who had lost everything and couldn't find a way to let go. We should continue, Gart said, turning his horse back to the path. We're almost there. As they rode on, the forest began to thin. The mist pulled back like a curtain, and suddenly they emerged onto a cliff path. Below them, the North Sea churned against jagged rocks, its waters black and foaming. The wind here was fierce, cutting through their clothes despite the strange warmth of the horses. And there, rising from the clifftop like a dark crown, was Tritania Keep. The castle was enormous, built from black stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. 4 towers rose at its corners, their tops disappearing into the low clouds. The main keep was surrounded by thick walls, and Margaret could see arches, slits, and battlements designed to withstand any siege. But what struck her most was the complete absence of light. No torches burned in the windows, no smoke rose from chimneys. It looked like a place that had forgotten how to live. Welcome, Gaillard said, to your new home. As they approached the massive iron gates, they swung open of their own accord, groaning on ancient hinges. The courtyard beyond was paved with dark stone, and strange symbols had been carved into the ground. Circles and runes that glowed faintly blue in the darkness. Protection wards, Gaillard explained, seeing Margaret's concerned look. They keep out those who would wish me or now you harm. No mortal army, no angry mob, no creature of darkness can cross those runes without my permission. The horses stopped in the center of the courtyard, and Gar dismounted with fluid grace. He helped each child down, his touch surprisingly gentle. When he reached for Edmund, the little boy looked up at him without fear. Your mustache is funny, Edmund said seriously. Geard blinked, then did something Margaret wouldn't have believed possible. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face. For just a moment, he looked less like a monster and more like the man he must have been centuries ago. So I've been told, he said softly. The great doors of the keep opened and warm lights spilled out into the courtyard. Margaret gasped. Inside, she could see a vast hall with a roaring fireplace, tapestries on the walls, and tables laden with food, bread, meat, fruits, and wine. "You're hungry," Gayard said simply. "Come, eat, rest. Tomorrow we will discuss the arrangement more fully, but tonight you are my guests." He walked toward the entrance, then paused and looked back at them. "And you need not fear me, whatever I am, whatever I have become. I swear on the memory of my son that no harm will come to any of you within these walls." Margaret met his red eyes and saw the truth there. She reached for her children's hands. "Come," she said, "let's go inside." Together, the 6 of them followed the vampire king into Tritania Keep, crossing the threshold into a new life, one filled with magic, mystery, and perhaps against all odds, hope. The warmth hit them like a wave as they crossed the threshold. After weeks of freezing cold, the heat from the massive fireplace felt almost painful against Margaret's skin. She watched her children's faces transform. Edmund's eyes went wide with wonder. The twins gasped in unison. Eleanor's perpetual frown softened, and even Thomas allowed himself a moment of amazed silence. The great hall of Titania Keep was unlike anything Margaret had imagined. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, supported by stone columns carved with intricate patterns of vines and mythical creatures. Tapestries hung on the walls depicting scenes of medieval life, hunts, feasts, battles, but all rendered in such detail that the figures seemed almost alive in the flickering firelight. And the food, God above the food. Long tables were laden with dishes that made Margaret's empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. There were roasted chickens glazed with honey, wheels of cheese, fresh bread still steaming, bowls of winter apples, flagons of ale and wine, and pastries dusted with sugar, a luxury she hadn't seen in years. "Eat," Gayhart said, gesturing to the nearest table. "All of this is for you." The children didn't need to be told twice. They rushed forward, Edmund nearly tripping in his haste. Margaret moved to stop them, to remind them of their manners, but Gayard raised a hand. "Let them," he said quietly. "They've known hunger too long. Manners can wait." Margaret watched her children tear into the food with a mixture of relief and shame. They ate like starving animals, which she supposed they were. Thomas tried to maintain some dignity, but even he couldn't hide the desperate speed with which he devoured a chicken leg. Elelina protected a plate of pastries like a dragon guarding gold, while the twins shared everything between them in the way they'd always done. Edmund simply held a piece of bread in both hands and ate with single-minded concentration. "You should eat as well," Geard said, pulling out a chair for her. Margaret hesitated, then sat. The chair was carved oak, more comfortable than anything she'd ever sat on. She reached for a piece of bread, then stopped, looking up at Gerard, who remained standing. "You don't eat," she said. "Do you? Not this kind of food." "No." His expression was unreadable. "But I remember the taste of bread. I remember my wife's honey cakes and the wine from our vineyards. Memory is a poor substitute, but it's all I have." Margaret tore off a piece of bread and chewed slowly, watching him. "Why do you keep all this food here if you cannot eat it?" "I keep many things I cannot use," Gayard replied. "It helps me remember what it was to be human, and I had hoped." He stopped abruptly. "Hoped what?" He turned away, moving toward one of the tall windows that looked out over the sea. "That one day I might have reason to fill these halls again, that Titania might be more than a tomb." Margaret swallowed her bread, which suddenly tasted like ash in her mouth. She understood what he wasn't saying, that he had been waiting for centuries for something to break the silence. And somehow her desperate prayer in the snow had given him that chance. "Mother, look!" William called out, pointing upward. Margaret looked up and gasped. The ceiling was painted with stars, not just random dots, but a perfect recreation of the night sky, complete with constellations. But these stars moved slowly, shifting across the painted firmament as if the ceiling itself was a window to the heavens. "Magic," Gayart said simply, seeing her amazement. "Old magic from before the church tried to stamp it out. The castle is filled with such things. Wards, enchantments, protections. Some I created, others were here long before me, placed by the druids who built the first fortress on this cliff." "Is it safe?" Margaret asked, thinking of her children. "The magic here answers to me. As long as you are under my protection, it will not harm you." In fact, he moved to the center of the room and spoke a single word in a language Margaret didn't recognize. The air shimmered, and suddenly the room grew even warmer. The fireplace blazed brighter. The candles along the walls lit themselves, and a soft, golden glow suffused everything. The children stopped eating to stare in wonder. "The castle knows you are here now," Gayard explained. It will respond to your presence, keep you warm, protect you from danger. Tritania, keep is alive in its own way, and it has been waiting for voices like yours. Edmund slid off his chair and walked toward Gerhardt, still holding his bread. He stopped in front of the vampire king and looked up with complete trust in his eyes. Are you going to hurt us? He asked with the bluntness only a child could manage. Gerd knelt down, bringing himself to Edmund's eye level. This close, Margaret could see the details she'd missed before, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of age and sorrow, the pale quality of his skin, the way his red eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. He was both beautiful and terrifying, human and inhuman all at once. No, child, Gerhard said softly. I swear upon every year I have lived, upon the memory of my own son. I will never harm you or your family. You are safe here. Edmund studied him for a long moment, then held out his bread. You should eat something. Everyone should eat. Gerhard stared at the offered bread, and for a moment something cracked in his carefully composed expression. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out not to take the bread, but to gently touch Edmund's hair. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. But this food is yours. I have what I need. Where do you sleep? Anne asked suddenly, appearing at her brother's side. Do you have a coffin? Father Benedict said. Vampires sleep in coffins. Despite the grimness of the question, Gerhard actually smiled. That same small, sad smile Margaret had seen in the courtyard. Father Benedict told you many foolish things. I sleep in a bed like any man, though I must sleep during the day when the sun is high. Sunlight would burn me to ash in moments. Can you turn into a bat? William asked eagerly. No, can you control minds? Not in the way you mean. I can influence the weak-willed, those who are drunk or afraid, but I cannot command thoughts or steal memories. Thomas stepped forward, his young face serious. Can you make others like you, turn them into vampires? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Gerd stood, his expression hardening. Yes, but I never have and never will. The transformation requires an exchange of blood and a willing subject. It is a curse I would not wish upon anyone. But you chose it, Margaret said quietly. I chose damnation because I thought I could use it to save others. I was young, arrogant, and blind with grief. I didn't understand the price until it was too late. He looked at each of the children in turn. Whatever you may think of me, understand this. I am not a monster by choice, but by consequence, and I have spent 3 centuries trying to find some kind of redemption. Elinor, who had been listening intently while protecting her pastries, spoke up. How do you find redemption? Gerhard looked at her, surprised by the insight in her question. I hunt those who prey on the innocent. I protect the villages around Tritania, though they fear me. I have used my wealth, and I have considerable wealth accumulated over centuries to help when I can, he paused. But true redemption that I think is impossible for one such as me. That's sad, Anne said simply. Yes, Gerhard agreed. It is. Margaret rose from her chair, brushing crumbs from her worn dress. You said we would serve you. What exactly do you expect of us? Gerhard turned to face her fully. I expect you to live, to fill these halls with voices and laughter, to let your children run through the corridors, to argue and play and cry and grow. I expect you, Margaret, to manage the household, to decide what is needed, what should be cleaned, how things should be run. You will have access to my resources within reason. And in return, you give Tritania what it has lacked for 300 years. Life. You make this fortress a home again, even if only for a little while. His red eyes met hers. And perhaps you help an old monster remember what it was to be human. The honesty in his voice struck Margaret like a physical blow. This was no simple arrangement of servant and master. This was something stranger, more complex, a vampire seeking redemption through the presence of the very humanity he'd lost, and a desperate mother choosing survival over fear. We'll need rooms, she said practically, making her decision. The children need proper beds, clean clothes, and a place to wash. And tomorrow I want to see the rest of the castle. If we're to live here, we should know our home. Something flickered in Gerhardt's eyes. Was it hope, of course? I will show you to your chambers. They have been prepared. Prepared? Thomas asked. How? We only just arrived. Gerhardt's smile was enigmatic. I told you the castle is alive. It knows what is needed. He led them through a doorway and up a winding stone staircase. The walls here were lined with portraits, men and women in ancient clothing, their eyes seeming to follow the group as they climbed. Margaret shivered, but the children were too tired to notice. They emerged into a wide corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Geared opened the first one, revealing a room with 5 small beds, each covered with thick quilts. A fire burned in a small hearth, and the windows were shuttered against the night wind. "The children will sleep here," Gaillard said. "Your room, Margaret, is just next door. I wanted you close to them." Margaret checked the beds, testing their softness, and found them perfect. "Thank you," she said quietly. "There is fresh water in the basin and clean night clothes in the chest." Gaillard continued. "Sleep as long as you need. When you wake, there will be breakfast waiting." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Welcome to Tritania Keep. May you find peace within these walls." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Margaret helped her children into the night clothes, listening to their excited whispers about magic and vampires and castles. But as she tucked Edmund into bed and kissed his forehead, she couldn't help but wonder what they had truly gotten themselves into. Outside the window, the sea crashed against the cliffs, and somewhere in the depths of the castle, a vampire king stood alone in the darkness, listening to the sound of children settling into sleep. A sound he hadn't heard in 300 years. If you're enjoying the story, leave a like, a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to reply. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the softness of the mattress beneath her and the warmth of the thick quilts. Then memory came flooding back. The prayer in the snow, the vampire king, the impossible castle on the cliff. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, half convinced it had all been a fever dream. But no, the room around her was real. Stone walls hung with tapestries depicting summer meadows. A wooden wardrobe stood in the corner, and through the open doorway, she could hear her children's voices, animated and happy, in a way she hadn't heard in months. She rose and dressed quickly in the clean dress she'd found laid out the night before, simple but well-made, of better quality than anything she'd owned in years. When she entered the children's room, she found them already awake and dressed, gathered around the window. "Mother, look," Elelina called, pointing outside. Margaret joined them and gasped. In the daylight, Tritania Keep was transformed. What had seemed dark and forbidding by moonlight now revealed itself as something far more complex. The black stone of the castle walls was actually a deep charcoal gray, shot through with veins of something that sparkled in the sun. Quartz, perhaps, or something more mystical. The courtyard below was larger than she'd realized, with a garden at its center, currently bare with winter, but she could see the carefully maintained beds waiting for spring. Beyond the walls, the view was breathtaking. The North Sea stretched to the horizon, its waters a deep blue-green under the morning sky. Seabirds wheeled and cried above the waves. To the south, she could see the edge of the forest they'd passed through, and beyond that the rolling hills of the English countryside. "It's beautiful," Anne whispered. "Where is King Guard?" Thomas asked, ever practical. "Does he sleep all day?" "I believe so," Margaret said. "He told us sunlight would destroy him. He must be somewhere deep in the castle, away from the windows." "Can we explore?" William asked eagerly. Margaret hesitated. The castle was enormous and they knew nothing of its dangers. But Gaillard had promised they were safe, and she'd seen the truth in his eyes. "Stay together," she said firmly. "And don't touch anything that looks magical or dangerous. If you find a locked door, do not try to open it." The children cheered and rushed from the room. Margaret followed, shaking her head, but unable to suppress a small smile. After so long, living under the shadow of hunger and fear, it was good to see them acting like children again. The corridor outside their rooms was lined with more portraits. In the daylight, Margaret could see them clearly. Generations of nobles and knights, ladies and lords, all painted with remarkable skill. At the end of the hall hung a larger portrait that made her stop. It showed a family, a man with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a crown and royal robes. Beside him stood a beautiful woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile. Between them, holding each parent's hand, was a small boy with his father's eyes and his mother's smile. Margaret knew without being told that she was looking at King Geard as he had been, mortal, human, alive. The happiness in the painted faces was almost painful to witness, knowing what had come after. "That's him, isn't it?" Thomas said quietly, appearing at her elbow. "Before." "Yes," Margaret said. "That's his family, the ones he lost." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the ghost of a life destroyed by plague and desperation. A sound broke the spell, the clatter of dishes from somewhere below. The children ran toward the noise, and Margaret followed them down the winding stairs to the great hall. The tables were laden with breakfast. Porridge with honey, fresh bread, butter, jam, bacon, eggs, and milk still steaming in its pitch, but there was no one there. No servants, no cooks, no sign of any living soul except themselves. How? Elelina breathed. Who made all this? The castle, came a voice from the shadows. They all jumped. From a darkened alcove near the fireplace, a figure emerged. Not Gayart, but someone Margaret hadn't seen before. It was a woman, or at least the shape of one. She was translucent, shimmering like heat rising from summer stones, and her medieval dress marked her as someone from centuries past. "Don't be afraid," the figure said, her voice echoing slightly. "I am Else. I was many things once. Now I am part of Tritania, bound to its stones by oath and magic." "You're a ghost," Edmund said, fascinated rather than frightened. Elizabeth smiled, though the expression was sad. Something like that. When King Gayard transformed, the magic that changed him also changed the castle. Those of us who were loyal to him, his servants, his guards, a few others. We had the choice to stay, to become part of Tritania itself, to serve and protect even after death. She gestured around the hall. There are a dozen of us, perhaps more. We maintain the castle, prepare meals, keep watch. We are the reason Tritania has not crumbled over 3 centuries. Are there more like you? Thomas asked, his eyes wide. Oh yes, Oswald tends the armory, though there hasn't been a battle here in 200 years. Clara manages the kitchens. She was always the best cook in England, and death hasn't diminished her skills. Rodri patrols the walls, old soldier that he was. Albert's expression softened as she looked at the children. We have been waiting so long for living voices in these halls. You cannot imagine how happy we are to have you here. Margaret found her voice. Why did you stay? Why bind yourselves to this place? Elizabeth looked at her directly, and in her translucent eyes, Margaret saw deep loyalty and old grief. Because Gayard was a good king and a better man. What happened to him, what he became, was a tragedy, not a sin. He deserved better than to be left alone in his curse. So we stayed. She paused. And because he gave us the choice, he has never forced anyone to serve him, living or dead. The children had already started eating, their fear forgotten in the face of warm food and an interesting ghost. Margaret sat slowly, still processing everything. He's not what the stories say, is he? She said quietly to Elizabeth. The stories say he's a monster who drinks the blood of innocents and spreads death wherever he goes. Elizabeth shook her head, her form flickering slightly. The truth, he hunts monsters more terrible than himself and hasn't harmed an innocent in 300 years. He mourns what he lost and tries in his own way to make amends for the darkness he carries. She looked at Margaret with something like hope. You and your children. You're the first living souls he's brought to Tritania since his transformation. That means something. Before Margaret could respond, a door she hadn't noticed before swung open on the far side of the hall. Through it, she could see a library, shelves upon shelves of books rising 3 stories high. The castle is opening itself to you, Elbit said with approval. Rooms that have been sealed for decades are waking up. Tritania recognizes you as part of itself now. William and Anne had already abandoned their breakfasts to rush toward the library, but Elizabeth laughed. It's perfectly safe. That's a book of children's tales, believe it or not, written by a wizard in the old times, enchanted to show the stories in any language the reader knows. The magic is harmless. Eleliner stared at the pages which had shifted to English, showing an illustrated story about a brave knight and a clever fox. This is amazing, she breathed. Thomas had found another section filled with books on astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. Are these all real? Can we read them? Everything in this castle is yours to use, Elizabeth said. King Gard made that clear before he retired for the day. He said. She paused as if remembering exact words. He said, let them explore, let them learn, let them live as they could never live before. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. Whatever Gay was, whatever darkness he carried, he was giving her children something precious. Safety, comfort, knowledge, and the freedom to simply be children. She spent the morning exploring with them. The castle revealed itself room by room. A music chamber with instruments that played themselves when touched. A conservatory where magical enchantments kept summer flowers blooming despite winter's grip. A hall of mirrors that showed not reflections, but memories of the castle's past. they saw more ghosts. Oswald, a gruff old warrior who showed Thomas the armory with obvious pride. Clara, whose spectral form somehow managed to radiate warmth and grandmother energy. Rodri, who watched from the battlements with eternal vigilance. All of them had the same story. They had served Gaillard in life and chose to stay in death, bound to Tritania by loyalty and love. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Margaret found herself in what must have been Gaillard's study. The room was austere, a desk covered with maps and books, a single chair, walls lined with more books and strange artifacts. On the desk sat an hourglass, but the sand inside flowed upward instead of down, defying natural law. She picked up one of the books and found it was a journal written in a precise hand. She knew she shouldn't read it, but curiosity won out. She opened to a random page and read, "Year 247 of my curse. The village of Ashford was threatened by bandits again. I dealt with them as I always do, swiftly, without mercy. Their blood tasted of ale and cruelty. Afterward, the villagers left offerings at the forest edge as they always do. Bread, cheese, flowers. They fear me, yet they know I protect them. Is that enough? Can protecting those who fear you be called redemption?" Another entry from years later. "I walked through the halls today and heard only my own footsteps. Elizabeth tries to comfort me. But what comfort can a ghost offer a monster? I find myself standing in the nursery, sometimes looking at Aldrich's toys still perfectly preserved. I cannot let them go, yet I cannot bear to look at them. This is my hell. Not fire and damnation, but memory and loneliness stretching into eternity." And finally, an entry from just a few weeks past. "Tonight I heard a prayer on the wind, a mother's prayer, desperate and pure. It called to something I thought I had lost. The memory of what it was to want to protect, not from duty or curse, but from love. Tomorrow I will answer that prayer. Perhaps it is foolish. Perhaps it will bring only more pain. But for the first time in centuries, I feel something like hope." Margaret closed the journal, her eyes wet. She understood now. Gaillard hadn't saved them out of charity or obligation. He'd saved them because he needed saving, too. From loneliness, from the weight of centuries, from forgetting what it meant to be human. A sound made her turn. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and there in the doorway stood Gaillard. His white hair caught the last rays of sunlight slanting through the window behind her, and his red eyes glowed softly in the gathering darkness. "You read my journal," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No." He stepped into the room, moving with that unnatural grace. "You have every right to know what you're living with." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Margaret said quietly, "You're not a monster, King Guard. You're just a man who's been alone too long." His expression cracked just slightly. "I am both, Margaret Hale. Never forget that." "Then perhaps," she said, surprising herself with her boldness, "you need people who can see the man even when the monster is present." Gaillard stared at her, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked genuinely shocked. From the great hall below came the sound of her children laughing, and somewhere a ghost was humming an old lullaby. Tritania Keep, after 300 years of silence, was alive again. The weeks that followed transformed Tritania Keep in ways that surprised even its ancient stones. Margaret established routines with the efficiency of a woman who had spent years managing a household on scraps and prayers. She rose with the dawn, checked on her children, and worked with the ghostly servants to maintain the castle. Elizabeth taught her which rooms were safe and which contained artifacts too dangerous for mortal hands. Clara showed her the vast storage cellars filled with preserved foods that never seemed to diminish, another effect of the castle's magic. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Thomas spent hours in the armory with Oswald, learning about medieval warfare and the history of England. The old ghost warrior was delighted to have a student again and began teaching the boy swordplay with wooden practice blades. Eleanor claimed the library as her kingdom, devouring books at a pace that amazed Margaret. The enchanted children's book became her favorite, but she also tackled histories, besties, and even basic texts on magic theory. Though Elizabeth warned her sternly that reading about magic and practicing it were two very different things. The twins, William and Anne, explored every corner of the castle with boundless energy. They discovered a room where time moved slower. An hour inside equaled mere minutes outside. They found a courtyard where stone statues of animals would animate and play with them when the moon was full. They learned the names of every ghost and treated them with the casual familiarity of children who no longer found death frightening. And Edmund, the youngest, became Gayart's shadow. It started innocently enough. The vampire king would emerge each evening as the sun set, and Edmund would be waiting in the great hall, always with questions. Why do your eyes glow? Does blood taste good? Can you teach me magic? Do you miss the sun? At first, Gayard answered with careful patience, clearly uncomfortable with such direct interrogation, but Edmund's innocent curiosity wore down his walls. Soon Margaret would find them together in the study, Edmund sitting on the floor, playing with ancient chess pieces, while Gayard worked on his endless correspondence, managing the hidden network of informants and protections he maintained across the region. One evening, Margaret descended to the great hall to find Gayard kneeling beside Edmund, showing him something in his palm. As she drew closer, she saw it was a flower, a perfect rose, its petals made of ice that never melted, glowing with soft blue light. I made this for Aldrich, Gayard was saying quietly on his FTH birthday. He wanted to see snow in summer, so I learned ice magic just to make him smile. Edmund touched the frozen rose with gentle fingers. He was lucky to have you as a father. Gayard's expression crumbled. For a moment, he looked as though Edmund had struck him. Then he carefully placed the rose in the boy's hands. Keep it, he said, his voice rough. It will never melt, never fade. Keep it and remember that even monsters can love. Margaret felt her heart twist. She'd been watching Gayheart for weeks now, seeing how he interacted with her children, always careful, always gentle, always maintaining distance as if afraid his touch might corrupt them. But she could see the hunger in his eyes when he watched them play, the longing when he heard them laugh. He was starving for connection, for family, for the humanity he'd lost. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret found Gyrd on the battlements. He stood at the edge, looking out over the moonlit sea, the wind whipping his crimson cloak around him. He didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he'd heard her. Vampires heard everything. You shouldn't be out here, he said. It's cold. I'm dressed warmly enough. She joined him at the wall, following his gaze out over the water. You're avoiding me. I avoid everyone, not the children, especially not Edmund. Gahard was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the wind. He reminds me of Aldrich. The way he looks at the world with such wonder, such trust. It's painful. Is that why you gave him the rose? I gave it to him because he should have something beautiful in this dark place. Gayard finally turned to look at her, his red eyes glowing in the darkness. You've been here a month now. Are you happy? Are your children safe and fed and warm? You know we are. The castle provides everything we need. Then I have fulfilled my promise. You may stay as long as you wish until your children are grown if you desire. But Margaret, he hesitated, an unusual thing for someone who usually spoke with such certainty. I need you to understand what I am, what I do. You hunt criminals and monsters. Yes, but I also kill, Margaret. I drain the blood from men and leave their corpses for the crows. I am judge, jury, and executioner. And I make those decisions alone in the darkness. His hands gripped the stone wall so hard she heard it crack. I have tried to be just, to only take those who deserve death. But I am still a predator, and there is a part of me that hungers for the kill. That part grows stronger as the years pass. Margaret studied his profile. The sharp features, the pale skin, the white hair that made him look like winter personified. Why are you telling me this? Because I see how your children look at me, especially Edmund. They're beginning to see me as something other than a monster, and I cannot allow them to forget what I am. If they trust me too much, if they believe I am safe. He shook his head violently. I'm not safe. I'm never safe. You haven't hurt us, not yet. But the hunger is always there, Margaret. Every time I'm near you, near your children, I can hear your hearts beating, smell the blood in your veins. It would be so easy to, he stopped, his jaw clenched. But you don't, Margaret said firmly. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it gripped the stone. His skin was cool to the touch, but not unpleasantly so. You resist. Every moment of every day, you choose not to harm us. That's not a monster, Gayard. That's a man with an illness fighting to remain good despite it. Ga stared at her hand on his as if he'd forgotten what human touch felt like. You should fear me, perhaps, but I've known men who were far more monstrous than you, and they could walk in daylight and eat normal food. She thought of the lord who had tried to force himself on her after Robert died, of the merchant who had cheated her out of her last coins. Humanity is no guarantee of goodness. You're a strange woman, Margaret Hale. I'm a practical woman. You've given my children a home, food, warmth, and safety. You've given them a library, teachers, even if they are ghosts, and the freedom to be children again. Whatever you are, whatever darkness you carry, you've shown us nothing but kindness. Kindness, Guard laughed. A bitter sound. I've forgotten what that word means. Then let me remind you. Margaret squeezed his hand. Kindness is what you showed when you answered my prayer. Kindness is how you treat Edmund, even when it clearly pains you. Kindness is every moment you resist the hunger you just described. You are capable of tremendous kindness, King Gayard. You've simply been alone too long to see it. He pulled his hand away as if burned, stepping back from her. Don't make me into something I'm not. Don't romanticize the monster. I'm not. I see exactly what you are. A man who made a terrible choice out of love and has spent 3 centuries trying to atone for it. That's not romance, Gart. That's tragedy. But tragedies can have moments of grace, too. Before he could respond, a scream split the night. Both of them turned toward the sound. It had come from inside the castle, from the direction of the children's rooms. Margaret ran, her heart in her throat, with Gayard moving beside her with supernatural speed. They burst into the children's chamber to find Edmund sitting up in bed, sobbing. The other children were gathered around him, trying to comfort him. The ice rose lay on the floor, still glowing, unbroken. Edmund, what's wrong? Margaret rushed to him, gathering him into her arms. Bad dream, he whimpered, his face buried in her shoulder. Bad dream about the winter, about being hungry and cold and scared. Margaret held him tight, rocking him gently. It's all right, darling. We're safe now. We're warm and fed and safe. But what if we have to leave? Edmund looked up at her with tear-filled eyes. What if King Guard makes us go back? I would never, Gay said, his voice strained. He knelt beside the bed, his expression tortured. Edmund, listen to me. You are safe here, all of you. For as long as you wish to stay, Tritania is your home. I swear it on the memory of my son. Edmund looked at him, then at the ice rose on the floor. You miss him, your son, every day. Is that why you're sad all the time? Gayard's composure finally shattered. His red eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. Could vampires cry? Yes, that's why I'm sad. Edmund reached out and took Gayard's hand, his small fingers wrapping around the vampire's pale ones. You don't have to be alone anymore. We're here now. The silence that followed was profound. Gayard stared at their joined hands as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Then, slowly, carefully, he squeezed back. Thank you, he whispered. Margaret watched this exchange with a lump in her throat. Her youngest son, with the wisdom that children sometimes possessed, had seen straight to the heart of things. Guard wasn't just lonely. He was drowning in grief that had never been allowed to heal, and somehow, impossibly, her family was becoming his lifeline. After Edmund calmed and drifted back to sleep, Gayard rose to leave. But at the doorway, he paused and looked back at Margaret. You said tragedies can have moments of grace, he said quietly. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps this, having you all here, is mine. He disappeared into the shadows before she could respond. Margaret tucked Edmund's blankets around him and picked up the ice rose, placing it carefully on the bedside table where it could catch the moonlight. Its blue glow illuminated her son's sleeping face. Peaceful now, safe. Outside, clouds parted to reveal stars, the same stars that moved across the painted ceiling of the great hall. The same stars Gayard had watched for 300 years of solitude. But tonight, for the first time in centuries, Tritania held not just a vampire king and his ghostly servants, but a family. And something ancient and wounded began, ever so slowly, to heal. The castle itself seemed to sense it. The stones hummed with contentment. The protective wards glowed brighter. The magic that sustained Tritania pulsed with new life. And deep in his study, Guard opened his journal and wrote, Year 300 of my curse. Today, a child held my hand and told me I don't have to be alone. I wept, something I thought impossible for what I've become. Perhaps Margaret is right. Perhaps even in darkness there can be grace. Spring came slowly to Tritonia Keep, as if winter itself was reluctant to release its hold on the ancient fortress. Margaret watched from the battlements as the first green shoots appeared in the courtyard garden. Clara's ghost tended them with spectral hands, coaxing life from soil that had been barren for decades. The children helped when they could, delighting in the simple magic of watching things grow. 3 months had passed since that cold night when Gayard had answered her prayer. 3 months of peace, learning, and slowly unraveling the mystery of the vampire king who had become their protector. Margaret had learned his habits, how he rose precisely at sunset, how he spent hours in his study managing the complex web of protections he maintained over the surrounding villages, how he would sometimes stand at Edmund's door just to listen to the boy breathe in his sleep. She had also learned that Gayard left the castle every few nights, returning before dawn with fresh blood staining his lips and a darkness in his eyes that took hours to fade. He never spoke of these Huns, but Elizabeth told her the truth. He tracked criminals, murderers, bandits who preyed on the innocent. The law was too slow, too corrupt. Gayard was faster, final. Tonight was different, though. Margaret felt it in the air, a tension that made the protective wards around the castle hum with unusual intensity. The ghosts moved with agitation, their translucent forms flickering more than usual. Even the children were restless, gathered in the great hall instead of scattered throughout the castle as they usually were. Gart emerged from the depths of the keep earlier than normal while the sun still touched the western horizon. He moved with urgency, his crimson cloak swirling behind him. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight. "Gather the children, keep them in their rooms tonight. Lock the doors. What's wrong? It's the blood moon." He gestured toward the window where the rising moon was beginning to show, larger than usual, tinted red by some atmospheric trick. Once every century, the moon turns this color. And when it does, the magic that sustains creatures like me becomes unstable. Unstable how? Gayard's red eyes met hers. And for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear there. The hunger becomes almost impossible to control. The beast inside me rises to the surface. I've weathered 2 blood moons in my existence. Both times I locked myself in the deepest chambers of the castle and Hadith seal the doors with every ward we knew. His hands were trembling. "Tonight will be the 3rd, and I need you to promise me something. Anything. If I break free, if the wards fail and I come for you or the children, you must run. There's a passage in your room behind the tapestry on the north wall. It leads down to the sea caves. Take the children and flee. Don't look back. Don't try to reason with me. Just run." Margaret felt ice in her veins. "Keyhard, promise me." His voice echoed off the stone walls, carrying a desperate edge she'd never heard before. "Promise me you'll save them, even if it means leaving me to the monster." "I promise," she whispered. He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Then he turned to the children who had been watching with wide eyes. He knelt down, bringing himself to their level. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice gentler now. "Tonight you must all stay in your rooms. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do not open your door for anyone, even if it sounds like me. Can you do that?" Thomas, always the responsible one, nodded. "We'll protect them, my lord. I know you will." Gart reached out and after a moment's hesitation, ruffled Thomas's hair. "You're brave, all of you. Braver than you should have to be." Edmund stepped forward, clutching his eyes rose. "Will you be all right?" Gard's expression softened, though pain lurked behind his eyes. "I hope so, little one. But if I'm not, if the worst happens, I want you to know that these past months have been," he struggled for words. "They've been the closest thing to happiness I've known in 300 years. You gave an old monster that gift. Thank you." Before anyone could respond, he stood and strode toward a door Margaret had never seen open before, a heavy iron portal bound with chains and covered in glowing runes. Elizabeth appeared beside it, her ghostly form more solid than usual. "The wards are ready," she said quietly. "Oswald and Roderick have reinforced the inner sanctum. Clara has blessed all the thresholds with holy water. It won't stop you if you break free, but it might slow you down." "Good." Gayard placed his hand on the door and the runes flared brighter. "Seal it behind me. Don't open it until tomorrow's sunset, no matter what you hear." "Gayhard," Elle said, her voice heavy with centuries of loyalty. "Be strong. You've survived this twice before. I was alone those times. This time," he looked back at Margaret and the children. "This time I have something to lose. That makes it harder." He opened the door, revealing a descending staircase carved from black stone. The darkness below seemed to pulse with an almost physical presence. Without another word, Gay descended, and the door slammed shut behind him. Chains wrapped themselves around it of their own accord, and the runes blazed with such intensity that Margaret had to look away. "Come," Elizabeth said, her usually warm tone now commanding. To your rooms, all of you, Margaret. I'll help you secure the passage, just in case. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Elizabeth showed Margaret the hidden door behind the tapestry. Indeed, a narrow passage led downward into darkness with torches that lit themselves as they approached. The ghost provided them with warm cloaks and supplies. If you have to flee, Elizabeth said, follow the passage all the way down. It opens onto a beach. There's a boat hidden in the caves, small but seaworthy. Row south along the coast until you reach the village of Homestead. Don't mention Tritonia. Don't mention Gayard. Just say you're refugees from the north. Will he really lose control? Margaret asked quietly, aware of the children listening in the next room. Elizabeth's expression was grave. The blood moon affects all creatures of magic, but vampires most of all. It strips away the control they've built over decades or centuries. What remains is pure predator. Hunger and instinct, nothing more. She paused, but Gayart is strong, stronger than most. He survived this before. He'll survive it again. You don't sound certain. I'm not, Elizabeth admitted. This time he has living humans in his castle, living blood, the temptation. She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. As the moon rose higher, turning from red to deep crimson, the castle itself seemed to respond. The walls groaned. The protective wards flickered and pulsed. Somewhere in the depths below, Margaret heard something that might have been a scream or a roar. She gathered the children in their room, locking the door and pushing a heavy chest in front of it. Thomas helped without being asked, his young face set with determination. Eleanor clutched a book like a talisman. The twins held hands, their eyes wide. Edmund clung to his ice rose, its blue glow, a small comfort against the growing darkness. Tell us a story, Mother, Anne whispered, like you used to before the hunger, before the cold, before everything changed. Margaret sat on the floor with them, pulling them close. Once upon a time, she began, her voice steady despite her fear. There was a king who loved his family so much that he would have done anything to save them. She told them Gayart's story, not as a horror tale, but as a tragedy. She spoke of love and loss, of choices made in desperation, of a man trying to find redemption in an eternity of darkness. The children listened, transfixed, as outside the moon climbed higher and turned the color of fresh blood. A crash echoed through the castle. Something heavy breaking, something massive moving. The walls shuddered. Margaret heard Elizabeth's voice chanting in Latin, reinforcing the wards. Oswald's battle cry rang out, though what a ghost could do against a rampaging vampire, she didn't know. Another roar closer now. Something was coming up from the depths. Margaret's heart pounded as she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, irregular, more beast than man. They stopped outside the children's door, silence. Then a voice, Gayard's voice, but twisted, rough, barely recognizable. Margaret, she held her breath. The children pressed against her, terrified. I can smell you. Smell your blood, so warm, so alive. The door handle rattled. Let me in, please, I'm so hungry. That's not him. Thomas whispered. That's the monster. No, Edmund said suddenly, pulling away from Margaret. Before she could stop him, he walked to the door. King Gayard, it's me, Edmund. Remember, Edmund? The voice on the other side grew slightly more human. No, stay back. I can't control. You gave me the ice rose, Edmund continued, pressing his small hand against the door. You made it for your son. You loved him. You can love again. You don't have to be the monster. A sound like sobbing came from the corridor. I'm trying so hard, but the hunger. Margaret moved to Edmund's side, placing her hand beside his on the door. We're not afraid of you, Gayard. We know who you are. We know you're fighting. You should be afraid. He growled, I'm a predator, a killer. I want to tear through this door. And his voice broke, God help me. I want to drink until there's nothing left. But you won't, Margaret said firmly, because you're stronger than the curse. You've proven that for 300 years. One more night, guard. You can last one more night. A heavy thud, Gaird's body hitting the wall or floor. I can, it's too much. Then Elizabeth's voice sharp with command. Gaird of Tritania, look at me. More Latin chanting, and the runes in the hallway blazed with light so bright it shone under the door. Guard screamed, a sound of agony that made Margaret's blood run cold. The wards are holding him, Elizabeth called through the door. But stay inside. Don't come out until dawn. Hours pass like years. Margaret held her children, listening to the sounds of struggle in the castle. Gayard fighting against himself, the ghosts fighting to contain him. The ancient magic of Tritania straining to hold. Several times she heard him outside their door, alternately pleading and threatening, his voice shifting between man and monster. But the door held, the wards held, and Margaret never stopped talking to him through the wood, reminding him of who he was, what he'd built, why he was fighting. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the sound stopped. The oppressive weight in the air lifted. Margaret heard Gayard's voice one last time, faint and broken. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Then nothing but silence. Margaret waited until full sunrise before cautiously opening the door. The hallway was empty except for scorch marks on the stones where the wards had activated. Elizabeth appeared looking exhausted despite being already dead. "He's back in the sanctum," she said. "He sealed himself in when the sun rose. He'll need blood, proper blood from his stores to recover. But he survived. We all survived." Margaret sagged against the door frame in relief. The children emerged pale but unheard. Edmund still clutched his ice rose, which had never stopped glowing through the night. "Can we see him?" Edmund asked. "Not yet," Elizabeth said gently. "He's ashamed. Give him time." But that evening, when Margaret descended to the great hall, she found a letter waiting for her. In Gayard's precise handwriting, it read, "Forgive me for what I almost did. Forgive me for the monster I am. You should have fled, but thank you. Thank you for staying, for believing I could fight. You and your children gave me a reason to endure what I thought would break me. That is a gift I can never repay." Margaret folded the letter fully and looked toward the iron door that led to his sanctum. Tomorrow she would tell him that there was nothing to forgive. Tomorrow she would remind him that families stay together even in darkness. But tonight she simply whispered to the shadows, "We're not going anywhere." And somewhere in the depths of Tritania, a vampire king heard those words and wept with relief. Summer arrived at Tritania Keep with unexpected warmth, as if the castle itself had decided to celebrate survival. 2 months had passed since the blood moon. 2 months since Gayard had nearly lost himself to the hunger. In that time, something fundamental had shifted within the ancient fortress. The vampire king emerged from his sanctum 3 days after that terrible night, thinner and haunted, but unbroken. He'd expected fear, rejection, perhaps even hatred from the family he'd nearly destroyed. Instead, Edmund had run to him and hugged his legs, refusing to let go until Gard knelt and embraced him back. Now, on a warm evening in July, Margaret stood in the courtyard garden watching her children. The garden had transformed under Clara's spectral care. Roses bloomed in impossible colors. Herbs grew in careful rows, and a small fountain bubbled with water that never ran dry. Thomas practiced swordplay with Oswald, his movements growing more confident each day. Elinor sat under a tree reading aloud to the twins from an enchanted book that illustrated its own stories in the air above the pages. And Edmund was doing something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. He was teaching Gayard how to play. The vampire king sat cross-legged on the grass, a position Margaret suspected he hadn't assumed in centuries, while Edmund showed him how to stack wooden blocks into a tower. Gayard's hands, which could tear through steel, moved with exquisite care to balance each piece. "See," Edmund said proudly, "you just have to be gentle." "Gentle," Gyrd repeated, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yes, I remember that word now." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. This was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but small moments of connection, of remembering how to be human, even when humanity had been lost. Margaret. She turned to find Elizabeth beside her, the ghost's translucent form solid with purpose. "There's something you need to know. Something Gart should have told you weeks ago, but he's been reluctant." "What is it?" Elizabeth gestured for Margaret to follow her inside. They walked through corridors Margaret knew well now. Past the library where she taught herself to read Latin. Past the music room where Thomas had learned to play the lute until they reached Gayard's study. The ghost produced a key, an old iron thing covered in runes, and unlocked a drawer in Gayard's desk. Inside was a stack of documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Elizabeth spread them across the desk. "He's been planning this since the week you arrived." She said legal documents worked through intermediaries and old contacts. "Margaret Gayard has arranged for you and your children to inherit substantial holdings, lands, properties, enough wealth to ensure you never know poverty again." Margaret stared at the papers. "I don't understand. Why would he?" "Because he knows this can't last forever. Elizabeth said gently. You're mortal. Your children are mortal. They'll grow, marry, have their own families, and Gaillard will remain as he is, unchanging, undying, watching everyone he cares for age and die. The ghost's eyes were sad. He's preparing for the day you leave. Even though that day breaks his heart, I haven't said we're leaving. You will eventually, perhaps not this year or the next, but someday your children will want to see the world beyond these walls. Thomas will want to be a knight, Elelina a scholar. The twins will find their own paths. And you? Elizabeth looked at Margaret knowingly. You're young still. You might want a life, a future, even love again. Margaret's throat tightened. He's thought of all this. He thinks of nothing else. Every moment he spends with your children, he's aware that he's borrowing time. That someday you'll all be gone and he'll be alone again. Elizabeth touched one of the documents. This is his way of ensuring you're cared for even after you leave. It's the only gift he knows how to give. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret found Gaillard on the battlements, his usual refuge, when the weight of eternity pressed too heavily. The summer stars wheeled overhead, and the sea below reflected the moonlight like scattered diamonds. You knew I found the documents, he said without turning. Elizabeth showed me. I should have told you myself. He finally looked at her, his red eyes luminous in the darkness. But I'm a coward. I didn't want to admit that I'm already planning for the day you leave me. Margaret moved to stand beside him. And if we don't want to leave, you will. Perhaps not now, but eventually. Your children deserve to grow up among other people, to have normal lives. They deserve sunshine and laughter and futures that aren't shadowed by a vampire's curse. His voice was steady, but she heard the pain beneath. I've been selfish keeping you here, pretending we could be a family. We are a family, Margaret said firmly. No, Gaillard shook his head. A family grows old together, celebrates weddings and births, argues and reconciles, and builds a life. I can't give you that. I can only give you safety, comfort, and eventually the pain of watching me remain while you all fade. Is that what you truly believe? That we're just marking time until we leave? What else can I believe? He turned to face her fully, and for the first time his composure completely cracked. Margaret, I love you, all of you. The sound of your children's laughter is the only thing that makes eternity bearable. When Edmund holds my hand, when Thomas asks me about history, when Elelina shares something she's learned, when the twins convince me to play their games. Those moments are everything to me. His voice broke. But I am a monster. I will always be a monster, and you deserve more than a life spent with the walking dead. Margaret reached up and placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. His skin was cool under her palms, but not unpleasantly so, just different, just him. You are not a monster, she said. You're a man who made a terrible choice out of love, who has spent centuries trying to atone. You're a protector, a guardian, someone who saved my family when no one else would. You've given us more than just safety. You've given us a home, knowledge, joy, and yes, love. Her voice softened. And I love you too, Gaillard, not despite what you are, but because of who you've chosen to be in spite of it. He stared at her, stunned into silence. You can't. You're the man who rises every evening and asks about our day, who listens to Edmund's endless questions with patience, who makes ice roses and teaches history and ensures we want for nothing, who fights against his own nature every single moment to keep us safe. She smiled, tears in her eyes. That's who you are, Gaillard, and that's who I've come to love. I can't give you a normal life. I can't give you children of your own or grow old beside you or even walk with you in daylight. I don't need normal. I need this castle, this strange family of living and dead. This man who believes himself a monster but treats us like treasures. Margaret's thumb traced the line of his jaw. I know it won't be easy. I know there will be challenges, but I'm not afraid of the darkness, Gaillard. Not anymore. For a long moment, he simply looked at her as if memorizing every detail of her face. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. His breath was cool against her skin, and she could feel the tremor running through him. I don't deserve this, he whispered. I don't deserve you. Perhaps not, but you have us anyway. They stood like that for a long time, the vampire king and the widow finding in each other something both had thought lost forever. Hope, connection, and the possibility of happiness despite impossible odds. A sound made them pull apart. Edmund stood in the doorway leading to the battlements, rubbing his eyes sleepily. I had another bad dream, he said. About you leaving, King Gaillard. Gaillard immediately knelt down, opening his arms. Edmund ran to him, and the vampire gathered the child close, his eyes squeezed shut against emotions too powerful to contain. "I'm not going anywhere," Gerhard promised, his voice rough. "Not as long as you want me here. Promise. I promise." One by one, the other children appeared. Thomas, Alina, the twins, drawn by some instinct that their family was gathered. They surrounded Gard and Margaret, and for the first time in 300 years, the vampire king found himself at the center of an embrace, surrounded by warmth and life and love. "We're a strange family," Thomas observed with the practical wisdom of a 12-year-old. "The strangest," Eleanor agreed. "I like strange," Anne said firmly, and William nodded. Edmund pulled back to look up at Gerhard. "Are you still sad?" Gerhard looked at each of them in turn, these children who had invaded his fortress and his heart, who had seen past the monster to the man beneath. Then he looked at Margaret, whose courage and faith had given him back something he thought lost forever. "Purpose." "No," he said softly, and realized it was true. "I'm not sad anymore." That night they all returned to the great hall where Else had prepared a late supper, not for Gerhard, who could not eat, but for those who could. The vampire king sat at the head of the table, not alone, as he had been for centuries, but surrounded by the noise and chaos and joy of a family. The ghosts of Tritania looked on with satisfaction. The castle itself hummed with contentment. The protective wards glowed, not with defensive magic, but with something warmer. The magic of a home reclaimed, of life, returning to a place of death. Years would pass. Thomas would grow into a fine knight, trained by a vampire who remembered every battle in England's history. Eleanor would become a renowned scholar. Her thesis on medieval magic studied across Europe. The twins would open an orphanage in London, using Gerhard's wealth to help children as desperate as they had once been. And Edmund would stay at Tritania longest, studying magic under guidance, eventually becoming the castle's official keeper, the bridge between the mortal world and the immortal king who protected it. Margaret would grow old, her dark hair turning to silver, her face marking time's passage, and Gart would remain unchanged, ageless, watching the woman he loved age with a bittersweet mixture of joy and sorrow. But they would have decades together, decades of laughter and learning, of quiet evenings and grand celebrations, of a love that transcended the impossible. And when Margaret finally passed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Gerhard would weep tears of blood and pure grief. But he would not be alone because Edmund would stay and the family would visit. And Tritania Keep would remain a home, not a tomb. Some nights, villagers in the valley below would see lights burning in the castle windows and hear sounds of laughter carrying on the wind. They would whisper about the vampire king and his strange household, about the widow who had tamed a monster, about the children who had brought light to darkness. And they would leave offerings at the forest's edge, flowers and bread, and small tokens of gratitude for the guardian who watched over them from his clifftop fortress. The monster who had learned to be human again. The king who had finally, after 3 centuries of loneliness, found his way home. In his study, Gart's journal would record the years. Year 350 of my curse. Margaret is gone, but her legacy remains in every stone of Tritania, in every child who has found safety here, in every moment of joy that now fills these ancient halls. I am still a vampire, I am still a monster, but I am also a father not by blood but by choice, and that I think is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. And so the legend grew, not of a monster to be feared, but of a protector to be respected. The vampire king of Tritania, who had answered a mother's prayer and found salvation in the most unexpected place within the laughter of children, and the courage of a woman who refused to let darkness define him. In the great hall of Tritania Keep, the enchanted stars still wheel across the painted ceiling. The fireplace still burns with welcoming warmth. The library still holds its thousands of books. And in every corner, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echoes of a family, living and dead, mortal and immortal, brought together by love stronger than any curse. This is the true story of King Gear of Tritania, the vampire king who learned that monsters are not born but made, and that even the damned can find grace in the most unexpected places. If you like the story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me what impressed you most about it. Turn on notifications to always receive updates on future videos.